Welcome back. Let's now continue our understanding of the theories of myth interpretation in Chapter 2 of your Harris-Platzner textbook. We're now going to look at the internal theories. In the previous video, we just looked at the external ones that have to do with man's relationship with the world around him, his explanation of phenomena in the general world. And now we're looking at internal, which is basically between the ears. What is happening inside man's mind that causes him to come up with concepts that make their way eventually into Greek mythology and other forms of mythology as well. It might be helpful for you, if you ever have a chance, to read the work of the ancient Roman poet named Lucretius. He wrote a 6-book work, which we're going to describe in some more detail in a later video, called in Latin De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things. And he talks quite a bit about sensation. His main interest is explaining all of ancient Greek material as matter or void, so that everything can be seen as either indivisible atoms, which is in fact what the word atom originally means in Greek, indivisible atoms, or emptiness, the lack of matter. So almost like a yin-yang kind of arrangement with matter or the lack of matter, void. And as in the midst of this, Lucretius tries to explain all other cognitive processes as having to do with matter, including the images that we have in our minds, those that, for instance, come at us with sight. So that when he talks about myth, he imagines us as having images in our mind that we, maybe for emotional reasons, build up into matters that might scare us or attract us or somehow become memorable for us, and what might eventually become myths. So as an example, Lucretius imagines that men are obviously extremely afraid of lions, so let's put a lion. Men are obviously very, very afraid of snakes, so let's put a snake. Men are absolutely terrified of goats, so let's put a goat. Combine them all together, lion, snake, and really scary goat, and you get a beast called the chimera, which is in fact one of the ancient mythic beasts that we have. So it's possible that when myths were being investigated, it occurred to authors such as Lucretius that maybe our own sensations might have been at least partly responsible for the myths that came up. Make sure again that you check out Dowden, Chapter 2, because he also himself discusses a lot about the psychology of myths. For instance, the whole concept of the snake, the snake as a female creature, the snake that lives in the earth, therefore is associated with growth and prosperity, very female concepts, but which can also be very dangerous. So men have a tendency to fear the snake because the men are in fact afraid of the female side of their own psyche, and so forth. A lot of that gets built into these internal theories of myth interpretation, as you have in your second part of Chapter 2. Okay, so let me go through the theories quickly. Freud, of course, Sigmund Freud is the great psychoanalyst, and he did quite a bit of work in his studies with dreams. So the Freudian theory is that myths are associated with what people dream, what they remember from their dreams, and then turn into various stories. We do have, of course, the famous association between Freud and the so-called Oedipus complex, including even the fact that the wife of Oedipus, Jocasta, actually says to Oedipus, "Don't worry about marrying your mother. Men do that all the time in their dreams." If only Jocasta knew. So there is that connection. Freud himself, however, doesn't appear to have really developed the whole concept of the Oedipus theory himself. That appears to have been worked out from later followers of his theories. So it's somewhat of a misnomer to call the Oedipus complex a Freudian theory, but it is indeed connected with his work on dreams, that the whole relationship of Oedipus to his parents is the kind of thing that might be relevant to the way that men might conceive of their own parents in general, obviously in negative ways, and that may be the stuff of mythology if these are sensations that they have inside them that they cannot make any use of because, of course, society and just a sense of propriety prevents them. So that's Freud. his student Carl Jung, came up with the concept of the archetype. In his interpretation, myths were associated with particular standard story telling scenarios, especially specific characters that would keep coming up over and over again. So, for instance, all you have to hear is the word stepmother, and immediately you're thinking evil, right? The evil stepmother, of course, is a famous paradigm in Cinderella, and also, of course, Livia, the wife of the first Emperor Augustus, was a perfect example of the evil stepmother trying to get her son Tiberius, not Augustus' son, to become emperor eventually, and so forth. So the concept of particular characters like the wise old man, the young man in love, or the young man who goes out on a heroic quest, the sweet young lady who, the damsel in distress who needs to be rescued. Princess Leia in Star Wars is a great example of that concept of damsel in distress, who then is developed somewhat further. She turns out to be quite a strong figure in her own right, and is hardly a damsel once she's actually rescued, as it works out. So that concept is played with there. So archetypes are very familiar patterns, and most heroic stories follow those very specific patterns. So the archetypes lie at the basis of myths, according to Jung. Narratology somewhat follows the same idea, that narratology is talking about particular patterns of stories that come up. And so again, the heroic tale of the young boy who is separated from his parents, ends up being raised by other relatives, sometimes in a good way, like with Luke Skywalker's relatives, and sometimes in a not such a good way, like Harry Potter's relatives, but still is orphaned, separated from his parents, who probably died from some adversary that eventually this young man will have to face. So the young man grows up, and he ends up becoming especially noted for his heroic capacities, and he gets trained often by a wise old man, a Merlin type, like with King Arthur, and eventually grows up and has to go off on various quests and kill various monsters and save various women, and eventually has to confront the big adversary. And so then there's usually a showdown between him and the adversary, and after that he becomes king. But then something happens, and he, while he is king, he becomes split off from society, and eventually withdraws and becomes disgraced, and so on. So a lot of these things figure the way into the common patterns of heroic tales. Even video games often show these same kinds of patterns. Anime too. So that's what you see with narratology. Structuralism is, I mentioned before, the yin-yang concept. Structuralism talks about binary, that everything follows in either A to B, white, black, day, night, good, evil, up, down, man, woman, and so forth, city, country, many others. So structuralism says that myth is based on these polar opposites that need to be merged in some way, and if they're not successfully merged, then they can sometimes lead to major problems. This concept actually finds its way into the Apollo and Dionysus paradigms that we'll see in chapters 7 and 8, which also, according to the philosopher Nietzsche, formed the basis of Greek tragedy, as he wrote in an early work of his. So this concept of the split paradigm is the basis of the theory structuralism. Feminism, finally, is the theory, as you can imagine, that most myth-telling is focused on a woman's role in society, especially how she relates to her husband, what she's supposed to do if she is separated from her husband, as in the case of Penelope, how she's supposed to conduct herself, whether she can be on an equal footing with men or whether she must always be subordinate to them, what's supposed to happen when heroes appear, and how the woman is supposed to connect with the heroes, and what can happen if the heroes don't follow through on their promises, and so on. A lot of that is associated with feminism. One has to be rather careful, however, applying feminism to Greek mythology, because although I think it is credible that many of these authors, Euripides being an especially impressive example, but Homer also, show tendencies to want to explore the condition of women more closely. They show a definite interest in it. To call them actually feminist authors is probably pushing it too far. because they don't necessarily want to see the women as somehow changing their status or somehow becoming superior to men. It's more like they understand the situation that women are in, and probably even at times regret it, that women are not at a more equal footing, but they don't necessarily see any really effective way to change this in a way that will be eventually acceptable for society or for the men in particular. So feminism needs to be observed with caution. It's definitely important to understand the women's role, and you can definitely see many wonderful examples of that, very useful examples of that in ancient Greek and even Roman mythology. But you should be cautious not to over-push that, because it's my own feeling that these male authors writing these works would have been interested in the women's condition, and at times, as I say, maybe regretful that women did not have more power, at times amused by examples when the women actually do become powerful, like, for instance, the figure of Atalanta, described for us in Ovid's Metamorphoses. But the idea that women in general are somehow going to rise up out of their current ranks, that's a little bit before its time, I suspect, in the ancient Greek world. Okay, that should bring a close to the theories of myth interpretation as seen in Chapter 2. Please make sure that you also take a close look at this with regard to myth interpretation in Dowden's Chapter 2, so that you can get a relatively good, full understanding of what it means to understand mythology from a scholarly standpoint in the ancient Greek and Roman world. Okay, we now have completed our first set of videos on myth for the second day of this course. We now switched off for today, but when we come back tomorrow, we will go to the Chapter 3 and 4 videos in which we investigate our first author, Hesiod, the author of Theogony, The Birth of the Gods, and Works and Days, all about farming and proper and improper behavior. Okay, we'll see you next day, next video.